Hello, this is Jiangqiong Li. I'm a PhD student in inquiry methodology, and I'm providing quantitative methodological consulting service. Today, I want to share with you some considerations when we're working with Likert scale data. So what is Likert scale data? I believe most of you have already seen, use, and work with Likert scale data a lot in your field of research. So the Likert type scale are developed by Francis Likert in the 30s. It's used to assess person-level opinions, attitudes, or behaviors. It's quite commonly used in psychology, education, medical research, and social research. It's quite popular because this type of scale allows researchers to operationalize individuals' perceptions. This type of scale are rating scales. So often it's used in ordinal measure to assess the target concept, and it has multiple categories. So although these categories are ranked, but the distance between categories are not measurable, and it's not necessarily equal. Here are some examples of Likert scale data. So I present three types of maybe commonly see or use the Likert scale type. A 5-point scale on frequency. So you will see we have 5 categories in the response, measuring a frequency. It's ranked from never to always. So this is an example we call as unipolar scale. So meaning this, you can see this as a type of ordinal continuum from the bottom level, the least frequent level to the most frequent level. And the second example is also a 5-point scale measuring satisfaction. But this example is slightly different from above. It's a bipolar scale. So meaning we have this mid category of neither satisfied or dissatisfied. As a midpoint, most like neutral. And then we have 2 extremes on both sides. And the third example is a 7-point scale on agreement. It's quite similar to the second example, and the only difference is we have more categories in the third example. And what do we observe? So we can see the Likert scales commonly have 5 or 7 categories. Well, with exception, here we want to compare is the categories can be either even numbered or odd numbered. With odd numbered categories, we can set the mid category as a neutral category. So the middle category is often having a neutral stance, and then we have a positive side and a negative side. And more categories, for example, if you compare 5-point scale to a 7 scale type scale, we can see more categories can capture more information because each of the scale carries a certain level of information. But also it can be confusing to your participants because it makes them more difficult to decide which category to choose. And fewer categories will provide less detail but more user-friendly. And very important, if you decide your scale of measure, you want to avoid overlaps, meaning we don't want to either of the 2 categories to be ambiguous to distinct from each other. For example, we have a 6-point Likert scale, but we see the 3rd category and the 4th category, it's actually kind of similar to each other. They're overlappings. So we want to avoid this type of category settings. And when we work with Likert scale data, there are some considerations that we should put in mind. I will talk about these considerations from 2 aspects. First, as a survey developer, you want to consider first dimensionality of your survey, and second, to keep your scale, to keep the Likert scale consistent throughout your survey. And if you're analyzing survey data, then there are some considerations in how to report descriptive statistics and how to create a composite score. First, when developing a survey, the dimensionality consideration is simply a question: how many underlying constructs are measured in your survey? There are two types. First is unidimensional. I think this is the most seen type of survey, meaning the survey measures a single underlying construct using all the survey questions. And the second type is obviously the multidimensional, meaning the underlying construct being measured consists of multiple subdimensions. And the survey questions implied a different group of questions to measure each of the dimensions separately. And what is scale consistency? Scale consistency is actually the considerations of how to decide on scales, meaning how to decide the response category to your question, to your survey questions. If it's a unidimensional survey, then you should keep all the scale consistent. You should keep your scale consistent for all questions. That means, for example, if you're asking respondents about the frequency of certain behavior, and you're using a 5-point Likert scale from never to always, then you want to keep using this scale throughout all questions. And if it's a multidimensional survey, then you should at least keep the scale consistent within each dimension. This is kind of similar to the above. Is when you have a single dimension, then the scale should be consistent within this dimension. But when your survey consists of several dimensions, then within each dimension, the scale should be consistent. And if you're using different scales in your survey, then you should have a plan how those scales compose the overall index being measured. For example, if you're assessing students' overall academic performance, then the performance may be assessed from multiple aspects or multiple dimensions. For example, in art course, in science course, in communication, in out course activities. So all those performance can be assessed using different scales. And when you want to compose the overall measure of performance using questions of different Likert scales, then you want to have a plan of how to compose your overall measure. So if you're analyzing Likert type survey data, some of the consideration may be how to report descriptive statistics and how to compute the overall score from a unidimensional measure or from a multidimensional measure. So I'm going to give you some examples, very basic examples to explain this. So first example, this is a unidimensional measure of employment self-esteem. So I'm just showing a few questions. This is not the entire survey, obviously, but I'm only, for the display purpose, I'm only showing 6 questions, and the sample size is 8. And all this question is measuring one single construct, which is employment self-esteem. And this is a 5-point Likert scale, measuring agreement from 1 equals strongly disagree to 5 equals strongly agree. So these are the questions, question 1 to 6. And this is a view of the data, of fake data, of course, but so we can see for each of the question, our 8 participants give their response, what level of their agreement to these 6 questions. And from this example, how should we report descriptive statistics for each item, meaning for each question? So we can report very commonly we see researchers report average score, meaning for each item throughout all your participants, you can compute an average score. Then we will see, for example, for question 3, the average score is 5.13. So back here we say, okay, a score of 5 represents neutral. Then the average score gives you a conceptual of what are the sample-wise average score of each question, of each item. But there are something you want to figure out is, for example, for question 4, you have a score of 5.5, which is in between of score 5 and score 4. So it's falling between neutral and somewhat agree. Then what your consideration will be, which response category does a score of 3.5 for? Because it's in the middle. Is it neutral or somewhat agree? So compute an average score is very common, but the link of the numerical score to the Likert scale category is one thing you want to have a plan before reporting the score and explain the score meanings. And another descriptive statistic we can consider to report is the response frequency. So this actually is report for each question. What are the proportions of response across categories? So remember our data, we have 8 participants. So here we say, for example, for question 1, we have half of the participants response neutral. And for example, for question 4, then we have half of the response responded somewhat agree. So this gives you an idea for each question how many respondents choose one category from the other. And these are the examples of report question level or say item level descriptives. And also we can report for each participant, report an overall score. So for example, we have 8 participants. Then there are 2 scores I see researchers to choose to report. One is the sum score, another is the average score. Because this is a unidimensional measure, and we use consistent scale for all questions, that meaning those scores we can kind of compute to produce an overall measure. So some score, average score, they're just mathematical computation, but some considerations here will arise too. For example, if you're using the sum score, then what would a score of 20 mean for participants 6? Because remember, the measurement scale of each question is a 5-point Likert scale. And the overall measure is employment esteem. Then, for example, if you say participant 6 has a score of 20 for his or for her overall measure of employment esteem, then what does the 20 means? And average score is kind of similar to the Likert point, but still you want to establish some interpretive link between these scores, between these computational scores and the scale of your measurement. So this is a unidimensional survey example. A second example is a multidimensional survey example. So again, I'm showing a 5-point, actually it's a 6-point Likert scale from 0 to 5. And this scale is slightly different from previous one is we have 3 subdimensions. The overall measure here is the affect and pain. But this construct consists of 3 subdimensions. The first one, the second one, this is somatensorial pain supercluster. The second is emotional pain supercluster. And third is well-being supercluster. So these 3 subdimensions consist overall measure of affect and pain. And within each of the subdimensions, we have 2 questions. And all the questions are measured in a 6-point Likert scale from 0 to 5, measuring the level of pain, the level of feeling, and the level of well-being feeling. And these are the data. Still we have, for example, we have 8 participants response to all of these 6 questions. And here, I first visualize the structure of this multidimensional survey. So we see the overall measure of affect and pain, which is AP, consists of 3 subdimensions: somasensory, emotional, and well-being. And each of the subdimension is measured by 2 questions. And similarly, to report, we can report for each of the 6 questions, we can report average score as what we did in the unidimensional example. And additionally, we can report also for each subdimension to report a subdimension level of average score. So for example, the average score of somasensory pain is the average of the question 1 and question 2. And for participant level descriptives, we can compute the overall score of underlying construct. But here, because this is a multidimensional survey, then we want to have an additional consideration is, are these subdimensions weighted or not? Because from this structure graph, we can see each of the subdimension all contribute to the overall construct. Then we want to consider if they're evenly weighted or not. If when we say unweighted, actually it's evenly weighted, it's by saying these subdimensions contribute to the overall multidimensional concept equally. So for example, if we're computing the average score, then meaning each of the subdimension will weighted a third to the overall dimension, to the overall measure. So I'm showing an example of to compose the overall measure as the average score. So if we compute the average score of these subdimensions as the overall measure of the affect and pain, then each of the 3 dimensions actually have even weights. And another question is if we're using the sum score instead of average score. So meaning we're adding up each of the subdimensions and compose the overall measure. Then each of the subdimension will have a weight of 1. And how about we're computing the weighted measure, then meaning each of the subdimensions contribute differently. They can be different either in magnitude or in directions to the overall measure of the multidimensional concept. So we take an example. Here you can say we use the average score of each subdimension, and for the unweighted measure, we use an example of average score. But how about we use a weighted composite score? For example, if we assign weight to each of the subdimension as this, so the somasensory will weight at 0.7, the emotional pain will weight as 0.6, and the well-being will weight as negative 0.4. Then the overall measure can be computed using this formula, and you will have results like this. So what you can see is the unweighted measure the unweighted overall measure is different from the weighted measure. This tells you when you are analyzing a multidimensional survey data, you want to know if each of the subdimensions are weighted differently to the overall measure of concept. So here are some very common and very basic considerations when we work with survey using the Likert type data. And I give you, here are some of the resources in terms of designing a Likert type scale survey when working with the Likert scale data. So here are the examples we demonstrate here are really simple and very basic. Of course, there are much advanced methods to compose the overall measure. Instead of simply using the sum score or average score, we can use factor analysis to compose the underlying index being measured in the survey. And here are some references you can check out. Thank you.